the perspective of most of these presentations, has come into focus over really quite a few years, but really has been clarified in the last 5 or 6 years, is that the point of making these synthetic data libraries is really a data-centric view of computation. It is not so much about big agentic simulations as it is to do with an integration of information in a form that is organized around items that you recognize instead of being just a bunch of disordered information in the world. So the way I'm going to start, there's different ways to start this conversation. So the way I'm going to start is to talk about data and the unique individual. So we have all this data, but what does it have to do with you in particular? Like, what makes you different than you? And how am I supposed to know that? And this is an issue that historically we just really didn't have much access to individuals' local or microsocial or psychological state. We didn't have access to things. For example, if you saw traffic, you didn't know why someone was in the traffic flow. You might know how many people are in there. You might know about traffic jams and things, but you didn't know why they were there. Say, there's lots of things like that, or why they were using their phone at one point instead of using it at another point. There was not very much access really to the molecular level understanding of living processes. I mean, we understood there was DNA, we understood that there's, metabolomics and stuff, but at the level of detailed molecular understanding, say, of information transfer between DNA and RNA and shapes of things and proteins and stuff, we really just didn't have access to the basic data in ways that are really improving. But there were a few cases where we did have access to internal state information in ways that let us get the technology and the tools and the perspective sorted out. And I'll give you a couple examples of those kinds of cases. And it led to platforms that as other data came into focus, then the same kind of techniques and platforms were useful for that as well. As far as aggregate dynamics, is that once we had access to the internal state information, it just wasn't clear how to get to aggregate dynamics in any kind of reliable way either. So there are a lot of reasons to think we needed information about microstate, but then having it didn't necessarily get us anywhere. And these two things generally led to really a lot of skepticism over a long period of time on this kind of approach. I mean, I'm unfortunately going to start in about 1985 in this particular story, and I apologize for that. But obviously that's changing. We have much more access to internal state information about all kinds of things than we had before. And there's a challenge in providing a sense of understanding of the complex composite behavior that derives from that. And so I'm just going to go through a little bit of history just to make some of the points that I made clear. So in about 1985 or so, I worked in a variety of military-based systems that were ICT-enhanced military platforms. And so they were aircraft, they were satellite systems, distributed satellite observation systems, building space-based retina kind of systems. And let's just talk about the aircraft. The tactics of an aircraft and like what it does in certain circumstances and what the air crew is supposed to do, how the weapon systems are supposed to work, and what the kind of threats are that they're supposed to operate against and stuff, that actually is pretty well known. It's trained, it is exercised in a lot of detail. And so building out platforms sort of from a control point of view, we actually did build very high fidelity models of these interacting combat systems where they were, and so as we put intelligence systems of a variety of kinds in these systems or augmentation systems for air crew or something, we really were able to ask specific questions about how internal processes changed external aggregate behavior. And we had hundreds of these things, sometimes thousands of these things in interaction. And to get to Carlo's question, it wasn't collaborative, it wasn't cooperative, and it involved things like situational awareness, counterfactual exercise against a spoofing threat sometimes, deception and counter-deception effects. So the assumption of true data was simply never made in these kind of platforms. And so techniques and understanding of how to deal with those kinds of questions are actually relatively well developed in a setting just like this one. It's not the most pleasant setting to work in, but if what you want to do is move the technology by having access to internal state information, it's a perfect place to start, you see, from a technical tool-making point of view. And action assignment, which means echelon, so you have aircraft, you have weapon systems, you have a collection of things you're supposed to do, and you have agency that is distributed among combat elements. And so you don't have encapsulated agency. You don't have agent, like you're not an agent and you're an agent. You may have agency in the sense that a corporation has an agency among you, right? That the collection of you senses and acts in a coordinated way together under some, in this case, oftentimes a hierarchical method, but it's a distributed agency. And augmented cognition, extended cognition and agency, virtualized training, and from a policy point of view, what platforms to buy, what to put in them, how to train people, how to replace people with machines, and all those kinds of questions arose in this. You know, it doesn't sound like it's going to apply to this question very well, but it really did put us in a situation where we could go in and do this. Now, the thing is with the satellites, we were trying to look at cities. Now, it turns out at the time, because we're thinking of it from the point of view of basically a control problem, we needed a state estimate. And we had a detection threshold problem looking down through the atmosphere at like lots of little stuff running around in cities. Especially if you're looking with infrared sensors and stuff. I mean, it's just a mess. So the reality is that there's techniques called track before detect, tracking techniques, and they're hypothesis-driven tracking techniques. And so we wanted to apply them, and we needed source information about cities. And I wound up getting first a demonstration thing from the Defense Department agency, and then I got a Department of Transportation project to build out very detailed second-by-second simulations of city transportation systems. In response, they needed it because of the Clean Air Act. Now, this is from about 1990, but if you'll look at the top, that is opportunistic data. Some of it's controlled and some of it isn't. There's a middle layer. It's very much like this infrastructure style platform that Mata was alluding to. I guess he didn't really bring it up that way, but there's a middle layer of processes, and then there's a data flow that was assigning properties out of the census and traveler surveys and transit surveys and so on, assigning them to synthetic individuals. That there was a synthetic population, there were synthetic people that had synthetic activities specifically assigned to them and so on. And this is in about 1990, but we didn't really think of it exactly in this way, and we still did think of it as a modeling problem, not so much as a data synthesis problem, to be really honest about it. But this is, in many ways, very similar to the population synthesis project that Mata was telling you about. And if you look at the side over there with emissions inventory and so on, that gets replaced with infectious disease, it gets replaced with communication systems, energy use, lots of other things if we get the activity parts right. It's not always a transportation problem. And early on in this, you know, the Star Wars program was canceled. We weren't looking down anymore, but we were still doing this. So, yeah, it was a good thing. So what it comes down to is basically this picture. You have unstructured data feeding based on a query, which sets a context, a collection of processes, and it delivers a data library that is organized around things. In the case of, if you're interested in populations, those things are people, and sometimes those things have to have agency. So they have to have the ability to perceive and decide and act and do things. So this can be time series, it can be properties, but there's interactions going on among elements like people in every one of these layers. And then you're connected between them. And so you're an unencapsulated agent. So there's nothing about agency of this kind, which is functional agency, that has anything to do with encapsulated software objects. You can use encapsulated software objects to do certain things if you want to, but we're not talking about that. And I'm going to tell you that it's really important that you don't do it that way, because that isn't how the world is. And if you try and make an abstraction that is really grossly different than the way the world is, it fights back. So I'll just give you a little sense of it. Synthetic micropopulations for transportation. We're at the area of urban areas. And this is, I think, D.C. or Chicago or someplace. I guess it's D.C. Millions, basically. By 93, 5, we had layers of communication satellites and other kinds of things, whether you're talking about cell phones or long-distance telephones or other communication systems. So every time a message is emitted by one of these people and it has to go to someplace else, you get interactions among elements on all different kinds of levels. It's a very complicated thing from the point of view of the message, how the interactions work, and to understand how all that goes together. This happened there. This is just sort of a bandwidth analytics on the ground of cars driving around. This is a communication system with local style communication, looking at basically bandwidth utilization. These are power markets. So once we understood what the populations were doing, we had some access. We could change how the synthetic population is. There's not one synthetic population. There's contextualized, sort of infinitely many of them. So there's a Portland power grid, a bilateral clearing price, pool co-clearing prices, spot market prices. This is all based on demand-side modeling of individuals and the detailed modeling of transactions in the market closings in the energy markets. Madhav showed you this picture here of infectious disease work. This is sort of the end state where we were a couple years ago, but it started in 1998. And inevitably, this global synthetic information ingest and delivery platform between 2013 and 16. So scalability between 14 and 16 is global agentic library builds. I'm not talking about, from scratch building the whole thing, which can take a few days. It can be done in about 5 hours. That number is declining. National infectious disease test scenario is 9 seconds and declining. And what that means is not some gee whiz scaling stuff. It means that now this is feasible for productization. We're tool makers. We don't care very much about what the problem is. We want to solve people's problems. We want to build tools that fit in these platforms that they care about. Or we want them to build tools that fit in these platforms that they care about. These kinds of performance numbers and this kind of access, this is service-delivered, data-centric HPC, is at the point of feasible productization. We're there. It isn't like we have to worry about whether or not someday we can make products out of this stuff. We're actually delivering services. We have commercial partners and government partners that are customers that are interested in this. And the science, and I put science in quotes because science is a lot of things to a lot of people, but it's going to chase these applications and these synthetic information products in a variety of ways, very similar to the way it has done with social media. Okay? Which is to say, we didn't derive social media from science, is the point. It went the other way. It's going the other way around. And that's what's going, and it's going to happen now, because we are at the point where the performance characteristics, access, and feasibility is there. And it isn't just because of that 9-second result. That just illustrates that it's there. And it's going to go that direction because in a data-centric perspective, this organization around the items that you care about is a really efficient way to integrate information. You see? And it also means that the value proposition for these data libraries is a really good thing because there's a different data library for every application. Right? It means that there's a big value proposition in it. So anyway, that's the direction it's going to go. The last little bit of the history piece is that along the way, we have worked for 25 years on a theoretical foundation for a lot of this. And I'm not going through all the different things. There's statistical things I'm talking about. There's all kinds of things. But the sequential dynamical systems and the graphical dynamical systems works, which is about 25 years old. It's dynamics over graphs, spontaneously forming networks, algorithms and computational tractability, which is really important to understand how these implementations work, dynamical neutrality of functional network changes, where the system biology work is working up, as we heard earlier. We're approaching Avogadro's number of items, but they're distinct complex system style items. And we have also emerging work in DNA, RNA information bearing processes. So the data types that we're talking about are physical attributes, proxies, designed experimental access to data, administrative data, opportunistic, uncontrolled data, procedural data that Madhav talked about. We view, like what happens when you sweep your credit card or what happens at a traffic light is an algorithm. And especially as ICT things are invading the stuff we use, those are facts. Those are measurable facts, but they're in the form of algorithms. And the way that you integrate those with other kinds of data is you compute them. And the way you compute them is you put them in interaction, you compute them. It means that the computational species that you use is simulation to do it. Unstructured data is the largest source of, it's just by far outpacing everything else. Cost drivers have shifted from data creation to analytics. We've all heard about all these things. This is a little bit old pictures, but it continues on the exact same path, so I'll just show you anyway. This is cost per genome, which is an ICT-enabled big data issue. Cost drivers are shifting to analytics in this kind of direction, away from the cost of sequencing. As of 2012 or so, we were getting 2.5 times 10 to the 18th bytes stored every day, and unstructured data was growing like that compared to other kinds. The green is unstructured data, okay? Synthetic data libraries organize this environment. The purpose of them is to organize this environment in a context of a particular application and set of questions. And even though the total unit price is down, total investment is up, and that's very good news if you want to do this. So I need to sort of hurry up because we started a little bit late, and I don't want to continue. I may go a couple minutes over. I won't go long. I'm aware of the time. So synthetic methods are a fundamentally important answer to this integration issue. Okay? And agency has to do with how we organize these individuals, agentic, at least individuals, people, for example. So getting agency is right to the synthetic integration methods. So think about this. All these different kinds of bees in a beehive, in a given beehive, they all have exactly the same DNA. At that level, they're all the same creature. And they differ because of the way they're handled in the larval stage in the honeycomb. And the honeycomb itself is part of bee biology. So where's the agency in this? I mean, is each individual bee an agent? I mean, in a sense, they're an agent. But I mean, the fact of the matter is this is an integrated, hierarchical, and level system. This is an example of something. There's this African grasshopper. There's multiple ones of these that are found now, that if you stress them in the larval stage, they turn into locust. And until about 7 or 8 years ago, nobody knew these were the same species. But the genome world just runs around grinding everything up and sequencing it, thought they kept mislabeling these samples because they don't look anything the same. They don't have the same proportions. They don't have the same mandible construction. They don't have the same biochemistry, and they certainly don't have the same behavior. But they have identical DNA. And what happens with this is if they're stressed in the larval stage, they're converted to the locust. The locusts are what's called gregarious. They strip the soil, and they create the environment that continues to produce locust. And this was not understood. But the point is, you can't figure it out by looking at the DNA. It only happens in context. And my point is that the properties that you have will evolve and create situational context in exactly this way. It is not enough to simply specify a software object. The data libraries are actually situated environments for these things to unfold in, and they have to be included in the computation. The message passing among objects in these simulations will give you a graph. It'll give you a network. It's what we've been talking about with Madhav and what I've talked about earlier about induced networks. But the fact of the matter is it does not describe the underlying situated structure of the interaction with the environment itself, which is a much more complicated transmission environment and which also has a theoretical requirement. So the unencapsulated U is, if I say, okay, you have B12, you can't live without B12, you don't have an organ to make it. You have a microbiome in your gut that has thousands of different bacteria in it that together do make the B12. They act like an organ, but they don't have your DNA, but they're part of you. If you don't have it, you're dead. They're an organ, but they don't have your DNA. On the other hand, your matrilineal line defines the particular adaptation of the particular flora in your gut. It won't work. Mine won't work in your gut. Distributed selves and thinking. Neurons don't know what they're thinking. Distributed cognition. You may not know what you're doing in a distributed cognitive task. And a perfect example of a distributed cognitive task that animals that we don't think of as maybe very smart do very well is mate selection. Mate selection is distributed cognition, and it results in management of the genome, which is a very interesting cognitive result. And I won't go into this. Okay, but here's a better way to think about yourself as distributed. I say, where's your money? Where's your money? I mean, that's a dumb question. Doesn't, I say, where's your debt? And where are the processes that service your debt with your money? And you say, well, that's not really my agency. My agency lives inside my shirt. And I say, okay, fine, then don't pay for your car. Just turn off whatever that process is that's paying for your car and find out what happens to your car. It's part of your agency. It just is distributed. And it's a very natural thing. You don't have to get to online banking to get there. Bees do this. Mate selection is like this, as I said. Okay. So how do we represent massively interacting people? When I say massively interacting, you're interacting with a lot of things, but you're also interacting in a lot of ways, all at the same time. I mean, a simple example is you're driving to work, but you're also taking your child to daycare. You're interacting with the world in two different ways. That's a simple way. There's a much more complicated collection of things that you're interacting with simultaneously. So putting agents that are interacting in contextualized ways together is a goal. And this is what we're doing, and it's still going. So our focus is to focus on this data library as a coordinate system for the data itself. View ourselves as creating the data, which is then searched, and it's organized around the things that you care about. It doesn't assume encapsulation. It doesn't assume that it's data-driven by data being viewed as numbers, and it results in a platform. And I'm done. The point is we're focused on the platform. To do these kinds of things in problems and projects that we'll put on the platform. And so that's the picture that this unencapsulated agency, a data integration task, high-performance computing for these ends. Okay, thank you.